Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because I think sometimes people who are kind of critical of some of the whole missional thing, they focus in on this idea of contextualization, don't they? I think it's all about, I don't know, wearing tattoos or something.
Yeah. Well, I have no tattoos, and
Yeah, I
so
did notice that, or at least not on your face, anyway.
well, there's one right here. Actually that's just a birthmark, but but ultimately for me, I don't see, and I wouldn't teach that contextualization is that necessarily it's being cool and trendy. I think part of the challenge with contextualization is people often talk about it, particularly young pastors are cool and trendy, and so people think that's what contextualization is. But if you're pastoring or planning a church in Dubuque, Iowa, being missional and contextual in that setting is not a tattoo and jeans with holes in them and blonde spiky hair and an earring. So I think ultimately, I think what happens is a lot of pastors across North America, and maybe it's true in your context as well, but they go to a conference and they see a really cool, edgy pastor, and what happens is that pastor's invited to speak because he's at a cool, edgy church in a cool, edgy place, when the reality is most of the pastors are not in a cool, edgy place. And what happens is they end up hearing this and they end up planning a church in their head, not in their community. They say, I want to be like this person. And so they go back to Selma, Alabama, or to rural Vermont, and what happens is they've gotten a sense of, I call it demographic lust and community envy. They're envying the community in Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, or Manhattan, and really God's called them to fall in love with rural Vermont, and that's not the same world. And I think, John Knox said of Scotland, give me Scotland or I die. I think you've got to cry out to God and say, God, give me Detroit or I die, and I'm going to engage that. I'm going to be biblically faithful, culturally relevant counterculture there, which looks different. I don't care the way they did it in Orlando. I care what's the Bible teach, and how do I live out what the Bible teaches in Detroit. And I think that's key. So I think the danger is we fall in love with models rather than falling in love with the mission. And the models we see at these conferences, they're cool and trendy. That's why they get invited to the conferences. And so I think ultimately the challenge is for us to do biblically faithful ministry where God has sent us, not where God has sent some well-known preacher or communicator.
Very good, very good. I suppose then the other question I've got for you, going back to something you said quite early on, is that obviously when people are wanting to be culturally relevant, I think is the word you're using, you can, if let's say you're living in, a monocultural area, it's very easy to do that, and you have a target culture, and sometimes actually even within a monocultural area, you can, people hone down even more, don't they? And there's a lot of talk in church growth about that, isn't there? About having a target in mind, and if you want, I don't know, young white arty people, well, you better make sure you've got plenty of that kind of music in your church, all that kind of stuff. And I guess that's fine up to a point. But my question is, how do you do that if what you're trying to do is build a cross-cultural church or a multicultural church, which you talked about at the beginning, said one of your early churches was multicultural. And I just wanted to pick your brains a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's much more difficult. I mean, the reason that people do not see many multicultural churches is because most churches are not willing to invest to be multicultural churches. As a matter of fact, most churches that say they're multicultural really aren't. What they are is they're multiracial. They have people, let's say you're in Los Angeles, and there are Latinos and African Americans, Anglos and Asians all together, and they work together, they shop together, they go to the same movies, they go to the same context, and then they go to church together. Well, they're the same culture, they just look different. Multicultural is much harder because Asians lead in a different way than Anglos do. African Americans tend to communicate in a different way. Your Germans communicate in different ways than people from Great Britain. And so the challenge is not to force everyone into one culture. Now, the church we planted in the inner city, I would say that there were some cultural differences, particularly between the Latino community and the others. But the Anglo, African American, and Native American, we're very similar in the inner city because they're all there, they're all poor, they're all multi-generational poor, and so there were some cultural commonalities. The Latino community was probably different. We ended up starting a Spanish-speaking Bible study than a Latino church. But I do think you're right. There is a big idea movement on, I use the term focusing rather than targeting. There's a big movement to focus on a certain group. And how do you do that when you want to reach more than one group? Well, I think there has to be some reflection. And part of what you have to reflect on is that it is true that lost people will be most likely be reached by people who are similar to them. I mean, that's not a shocking bit of news. If I'm Haitian, I'm most likely going to hear the good news from another person who is Haitian. I'm most likely going to be incorporated into a Haitian congregation. That's not a surprise. I think the challenge is to recognize that as we represent the kingdom of God, where men and women from every tongue, tribe, and nation will gather around the throne, and we're supposed to be this sign and this instrument of the kingdom of God, if our churches look Anglo and our churches look Latino and our churches are all separated, I think that's a harm to our witness. So I think we need to recognize that it is harder. I wrote an article on this for Evangelical Missions Quarterly called Multicultural Church Planting Teams, The Promise and the Peril. I think we need to recognize there's peril. It is harder. If you have 3 church planters to come to London to plant a church, and there are 3 different ethnicities to start with, what happens is you've already have now 3 people trying to learn each other's cultures, so they can be in harmony and be in unity. And then what happens is you go into London and you want to plant a church among 3 cultures. Well, now you've got 3 more cultures to consider. And so what happens is, and the numbers here, you get all these different cultures, you've got these dozens and hundreds of interactions. And so I think there has to be a realism that comes, and I don't see many people saying, well, we're going to be multicultural. And they go out and do that, and then they're not multicultural. And then they're like, well, why aren't we? We said we were going to be. Well, it's much more than we said we're going to be. You need to learn the way people think. You need to recognize that there are parts of every culture that we reject, parts of every culture that we adapt, and parts of every culture that we adopt, and as we do ministry. And then what happens is we got to figure out how to do those together. So it's a lot harder, but I think it's worth the effort. I've been in churches, planted churches that were multicultural, some that were not, because of the context where we were. So I think it's worth the effort because it really reflects what the kingdom of God looks like.
Well, it's been fantastic talking to you. I just looked at my watch. We've been talking for like an hour.
Wow.
So I don't know if anyone's still listening by now. I hope they are. But thanks very much. Just before you go, though, tell me, are you a family man as well? Or
I am. I have a wonderful wife named Donna. She was my high school sweetheart. We started dating when we were 15, got married at 20. We have 3 little children, 3, 6, and, almost 10, 3, 6, and 10. And they are just a great blessing. 3 daughters, and so I love my girls.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.